of heightened tensions between Australia and Beijing. Since Australia called for an independent inquiry into the coronavirus pandemic, China has imposed tariffs on barley, halted beef imports, and also warned Chinese students against studying in Australia, while the government has been careful not to point the finger at Beijing publicly. It's the country most widely speculated by intelligence experts to be behind the cyber attack, and one of the few states, along with Russia, Iran and North Korea, which would be capable of carrying out such an attack. But whoever is to blame, the government is urging businesses to strengthen their technical defences as the attacks increase. Nicola Gage, Al Jazeera, Canberra.
A win for the Dreamers. The US Supreme Court upholds protections for the children of undocumented immigrants. But will President Trump try again to reverse the policy? And how will this ruling shape the election just 5 months away? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Imran Khan. They're known as the Dreamers, the children of undocumented immigrants who sought a better life in the United States. And their American dream is safe for now. The Supreme Court has blocked the president's attempt to end a program that protects them from deportation. The justices said Donald Trump's administration didn't follow proper legal procedure. It was the second Supreme Court ruling against the president this week, prompting an angry response from Trump on Twitter. We'll bring in our guests in a moment, but first, this report from Mike Hanna in Washington, D.C.
Jubilant crowds gathered outside the Supreme Court of so-called dreamers, the children of undocumented immigrants who are now assured of the right to residence for the foreseeable future. Between 700,000 and 800,000 people are affected by the Supreme Court decision.
I've had DACA since I was 15, 16 years old. It's allowed me to go to college. It's allowed me to get a full-time job. That could have all been stripped away had the court decided differently today.
Joining the celebrations was the Senate Minority Leader, Chuck Schumer.
This is just the beginning. You are going to become American citizens and great American citizens.
There was a vastly different reaction from a disgruntled president who lashed out on Twitter. Do you get the impression that the Supreme Court doesn't like me? He asked plaintively. These horrible and politically charged decisions coming out of the Supreme Court are shotgun blasts in the face of people that are proud to call themselves Republicans or conservatives, he continued. We need more justices or we will lose our Second Amendment and everything else. In writing the majority decision, Chief Justice Roberts made clear he objected to administrative failures in the Trump legislation, not the policy itself. This is similar to the Trump travel ban that was rejected by the court for the same reasons, but then approved when it was reintroduced in an amended form. Theoretically, the administration's lawyers could redraft the repeal to address the court's concerns and then introduce it again. The only long-term guarantee of the Dreamers' rights is immigration reform in Congress.
We need real solutions. We need real relief from Congress and from all parties, because that's the only way that we can get our path to citizenship and actually get full acknowledgement of all our contributions to this country.
This is a minimally acceptable program, and Congress cannot feel good about themselves that even throughout this entire to produce comprehensive immigration reform. So we are still going to continue to hold them accountable.
But that is all in the future. On this day, at this place, it's a time to celebrate, no matter how narrow the court's decision. Mike Hanna, Al Jazeera, Washington.
Let's bring in our panel. Joining us in New York Vincent Warren, Executive Director at the Center for Constitutional Rights. In Alexandria, Virginia, Adolfo Franco, a Republican political strategist. And in Washington, D.C., Laura Brown, Director of the Graduate School of Political Management at George Washington University. A welcome to you all. Let's begin in Alexandria, Virginia, with Adolfo Franco. The U.S. President says the Supreme Court doesn't like me very much. However, the White House has come out the gate swinging. It said it's going to take this back to the Supreme Court, amended, and it's going to fight this. What chance do they have of getting it through?
Well, I think a very, very good chance. If you read this narrowly, of course, or not to read it very narrowly, this is really a procedural decision. We can argue that, and I will in a moment, but the court did not suggest that the DACA program in any way is something that is required. It's not law. Obviously, it was an executive order by President Obama, and in the past, executive orders are rescinded at will by incoming presidents or presidents themselves. What the procedural aspect of it is the court has introduced a new concept here for really judicial involvement in these decisions of rescinding these orders in the future that says the Administrative Procedures Act, a procedural matter, was not followed when the president rescinded. Didn't question the president's authority to rescind the executive order. It's just a procedural aspect. Curiously, the Obama administration, when they promulgated the executive order, they didn't follow the same procedure. So it's a curious decision. I think it's a dangerous one. Executive orders are not law. And in fact, President Obama said in 2011, April 2011, he didn't have the authority to resolve this matter in the way he ultimately did. He changed his mind for political reasons. So it's a disappointing decision. I think the White House has made it clear. The president has already tweeted that they will, quote unquote, do the paperwork and move forward. I can't see, since the court has pronounced this to be the way to do it, how they could now, if they comply with the procedures, which is simply saying how they would decide how the president does not have the authority to do it, because he clearly does.
We'll get to why it had to be amended once again. It's the second time the Trump administration has done that. But before we do, I want to bring in Vincent Warren here in New York. What can be done to stop the White House from taking this back to the Supreme Court? Can anything be done?
Well, first of all, it's important to note that as a result of that ruling, there are now 700,000 dreamers, and these are children that have been brought to the United States who are undocumented, can now stay here. They can work. They can continue to lead their lives, many of whom have been here for 20, 30 years and don't know any other place. So that's an important aspect of this. With respect to what the president can or cannot do, it is actually clear that the president does have authority, plenary authority in some ways, over our immigration system, who comes in, who goes out, who stays, and who doesn't. But we shouldn't confuse authority for justice. And what has been happening with this administration is that they have been using essentially immigration as a political tool to whip up the base. And so even knowing that they didn't do the procedures correctly, they see the benefit of, number one, saying we're going to remove these young people, these dreamers, whether they win or lose. If they win, they lose, and if they feel like if they lose, they lose, because if they lose, they win, rather, because in the political context of the upcoming elections, they're whipping up the base. As a practical matter, yes, they can go back and do these procedures over again, and they likely will. And there's nothing that anybody could do to stop that process. We don't want a situation where, generally speaking, there are impediments on the president from moving forward to justify why they're starting or ending a program. That's a very important piece. However, you can expect lawsuits, and you can expect a lot of them. So as a practical matter, when they move this forward, there will be lawsuits, and it remains to be seen whether the Supreme Court or other courts will even get this case before November. This has been going on for a while, and this is 8 years ago that this program was put into place. So the Trump administration is really not thinking about good policy. They're not thinking about what makes sense for people in America. They're not thinking about what is fair and right for these young people that are working in our communities. They're thinking about 2020. And so they will make a lot of big moves and put this right back in the stream, and the lawsuits will happen again.
Actually, it's interesting. Let's talk about 2020. I want to bring in Lara Brown here from DC. Lara, we're looking at another election. We are looking at certainly some polls suggesting that Trump isn't as popular as he'd like to think he is. And then all of this is going on. He's had another fall at the Supreme Court. How much of an impact is all of this going to have on his re-election campaign?
Well, I think a lot will impact his re-election campaign. We do have to realize that the average of polls over this last month has shown that Vice President Joe Biden is leading Donald Trump by about 9 percentage points. Now, it is true that the polls can change, but it is also the case when you look at history that the polls at about this time of the year, in an election year, start to really suggest the general trends of where we're going to be in the final days. A lot of that obviously depends, and certainly some big events can change the polls quite dramatically. We might remember the recession in 2008 turned that race between John McCain and Barack Obama from being a close one to being a landslide in Barack Obama's favor. So it is the case that things can change, but there's no doubt President Trump has had a bad week. He's had Supreme Court decisions go against his and his party's wishes, and he has also had a former advisor be releasing a book that is scathing of Trump's leadership.
Adolfo Franco in Alexandria, Virginia. The essence of Trump's campaign, the essence of Trump's administration has always been built. Certainly one of the planks is immigration. To get this so badly wrong, so close to the election, is a very big tactical mistake, is it not?
Well, I don't think he's gotten it wrong at all. Just as your other guest who mixed up law and politics here a bit, I was trying to address the legal issues. First of all, as he acknowledged, the president has the authority, and this executive order, certainly if he's reelected, will be rescinded as a procedural bump in the road. That's all that's going to be. But curiously again, President Obama exceeded his authority. I think the executive order is illegal. You can't mix that up with there's 700,000 people. You're either applying the law or you're applying the circumstances of what's going on. This is the first time ever a court has ever given an opinion about individuals and ignoring the black letter law here. President Obama said, I don't have the authority, and he was right. He doesn't have the authority to legislate, and that's what this was about. Of course, President Trump in 2018 put forward a proposal to resolve this before the Congress, and it's the Democrats who want to keep this issue very much alive. Republicans would like to resolve it. I think there's a unanimous view in the Republican Party that we need to do something about DACA legislatively, and that was blocked in 2018 by the Democrats. So I see it completely different than the other guests. I think this is the Democrat talking point for sure. Lastly, on the polls, with all due respect, at this time, exactly, the other guest said that these pretty much gel or move the direction. She's right, anything could change positively or negatively. At this precise time, and I did it before this program, 4 years ago, Hillary Clinton was ahead in all of the swing states the president carried by a wider margin than President Trump is behind today. In other words, President Trump is in better shape than he was 4 years ago vis-a-vis Hillary. In the states that count, in our country, national polls, frankly, are meaningless. So if that's the test, it's a curious test, since that didn't pan out in 2016, and I don't think it'll pan out this year. There's a large number of the electorate that are going to vote for Donald Trump that aren't telling pollsters they're voting for Donald Trump. That's my opinion.
Vincent Warren in New York, Adolfo Franco actually says this is a procedural bump in the road.
Well, one thing we can agree on, Adolfo and I, is that this is a procedural decision. It doesn't rule on the validity of the program. It rules on the posture that this administration took. But there are some important points that are here. And, we talked earlier about mixing politics and law, and I think there's no better example of this than looking at the president's tweets themselves. After this decision, the president said, quote, "These horrible and politically charged decisions coming out of the Supreme Court are shotgun blasts into the face of people that are proud to call themselves Republicans and conservatives." Now, what's interesting about this is that, number one, President Trump, of course, ran on the immigration piece. That's his signature piece, and it does hurt both politically and legally for him to get this decision from the Supreme Court. But he also spent a lot of time talking about how he was going to reshape the Supreme Court and the federal judiciary. And to his word, he has put in place many federal judges. But what's telling is that as soon as he gets a ruling against him, the first thing that he is doing is attacking the courts. He's saying that these are politically charged rulings from the Supreme Court, when Adolfo and I would very much agree that these are procedural rulings that have political impact. And I think that's very important for us moving forward. And I think it suggests a dangerous trend with this president, which is that when he loses, and make no mistake, he lost and lost big here, that he starts attacking the structures that made the decision, calling them politically charged, politically incorrect, calling the judges corrupt, calling any system that's there unfair. And these are dog whistles to his base. And I understand the political elements of this, but it is also very dangerous in this time because we've seen over the last several years of his presidency that people are very much moved to violate these institutions when the president downplays them, and that's a big problem.
Let's bring in Laura Brown here. Laura, these are dog whistles. This is President Trump going after the Supreme Court for his base. Is his base going to get energized by things like this, or is there simply a fatigue? I voted for him before and may be on the fence right now.
Well, I think what's very interesting is we do see the president continuing to stoke his base with his rhetoric and his actions. The problem for him is that his base is already about as enthusiastic as it can get. So the problem for him going forward is that he is not in a position to be able to attract independents or even some weak Democrats who are displeased with the Democratic choices that they have had. And he is not in a place where he can bring aside, because all of his rhetoric is really about playing to the base. And this is where we see in the polls, what is fascinating is that his base is very enthusiastic to support him. According to the most recent Fox poll, 63% say they're excited to vote for him. But interestingly, 63% of Democrats say that they are afraid of Trump winning. So their fear about his winning is actually what's motivating the Democrats. And most of our research on this in political science shows that fear and frustration and anger are oftentimes a greater predictor of turnout and motivation than, in fact, positive support or enthusiasm.
So, Adolfo Franco, there is this idea then that the base is energized by things like this, by his words. They'll get out the vote, they'll try and get out the vote. But there's a moral issue here, and there's a justice issue here as well. These people have been in the country for maybe 20, in some cases 20, 30 years. There is a moral issue here. The US actually does owe these people certainly justice, if not the ability to stay. Sure.
Well, a couple of things. First, no one is suggesting that we don't want to resolve the DACA issue. The president has been talking about it and wants to do it legislatively. Again, I have a different view. I think the Democrats have been playing politics for this for a very long time. We've tried I worked for John McCain, we tried for many years to get immigration reform, and we actually had a stumbling block many years ago from, of all people, Barack Obama. So this is a nice liberal talking point, but the problem is one of law and morality, but one of legislation. We need to have this done legislatively. Curiously, when the Democrats had super majorities, 60 senators in the Senate under Barack Obama's administration, they did nothing about it. So I don't know where their morality was at the time. On this base issue, though, I want to just comment on this.
base, Republican base, of the Democrat base. I was talking about your other guest that there's only a Democrat, a Trump base. Of course, there's a Democrat base, and they're being stoked, and they're being, I think, going with extremism with what's going on in the country now with, I think, the outrageous attack on police and so forth. You had the Attorney General of Massachusetts saying that you have to burn the forest, referring to looting, before you can rebuild. And you had Councilwoman Democrat in Seattle saying, I don't know why people are so bothered about looting. That's not an incitement to violence. So it's curious how the press really gets away with, these Democrats get away with the most outrageous comments, nothing other than to simply say he wants to apply the laws of the United States. Clearly that executive order is illegal. Clearly that executive order, which should never have been issued, those were Barack Obama's own words, and it's a dangerous precedent that's been set, including by even the procedural aspect. I'm quite troubled by what the court has done. So this has all been done for politics from the other side. The last thing I will say about the polls, since this was conveniently forgotten here, the enthusiasm factor among Republicans, if you're calling the Republicans the base, go ahead. Then the Democrats are a base. Among Republicans, the enthusiasm factor is much, much higher than it is for Joe Biden, who has zero enthusiasm. And secondly, and I think this is an important point to be made, is those individuals that are likely to vote, more registered voters and so forth, favor the Republican Party. So I think this is, I hope they're overconfident. I hope they continue with the strategy they've pursued, because I think ultimately the president, we'll see how his rally goes in Oklahoma, and that will be a reflection of what I think the level of enthusiasm you're going to see for his reelection.
Laura Brown in DC, I see that you want to make a comment. Please, go ahead.
I do. There are a few comments I want to make. First, it's important to realize that, which hasn't been brought up, that executive orders do carry the force of law while that president or that executive is in office and until they've been rescinded. So there's been some suggestion that somehow executive orders are not legitimate governing tools. They just are temporary governing tools. And the Supreme Court's decision in this case is saying, essentially, as we've discussed, that there is a procedural problem with the way the Trump administration put forward their rescission, if you will. And I think what is important to realize is, practically speaking, this will not be decided before the election. And what the Supreme Court did wasn't make a curious decision. They did something that is historically quite standard for them. They threw the political problem back to the people and back to the Congress. And so this idea that the court was getting political or personal with the president is just simply wrong. The court was looking for a way to put this back into the legislative branch, and they have put it to the people, and it will be part of the test of this election. Second, I talk quickly about the polls. Secondly, when it comes to the polls, it's really important to realize that the majority of Americans are both with the protesters and they are in fact against the president. So there is a reality that the Republicans can talk about how great their Republican base is, but it has no breadth. It is a very small group of people at the moment, hovering around 39-40%, that are consistently siding on the president's views on just about everything. And so what we see here is that the majority of Americans are looking for change, and they are about to exact a referendum, a negative one, on this president's administration.
Adolfo, just very quickly, we are running out of time, but I do want your response. Quickly, what's your response?
Yeah, a couple of things. First of all, let me start with the last point. I'm curious if your guest predicted Donald Trump's election in 2006, frankly, completely baseless speculation and hopeful thinking. This isn't a small number of people, and the polls in the swing states don't reflect that, and we'll see how things happen.
That's not
American
true.
People are not.
It's simply not true.
Let me finish. I didn't interrupt you. The American people are not with the rioters, they're not with the looters, and they're with the police. And the other side is advancing an agenda to defund the police. On the Supreme Court, I have to make some clarifications. I asked your guest, Laura, to see President Obama's own comments in April of 2011 about his authority. An executive order, this isn't about the illegality of executive orders, they're issued all the time. There was an underlying statute of law, and President Obama correctly initially said that he had the authority through an executive order to implement the law, but not to make the law. And in this case, he made the law. So the Supreme Court needed to strike this down because it was an illegal executive order in the first instance. And secondly, again, even on the procedural aspect, if you get to that, the Obama administration did not follow the Administrative Procedures Act. And now it's being applied to President Trump, that he has to follow it to rescind an order. So this is a lot of red herrings here on both the polling, on both wishful thinking, and more importantly, the legalities of what has happened here.
I'm afraid we are out of time. I want to say it's a very spirited debate. I want to thank all of our guests, Vincent Warren, Adolfo Franco, and Lara Brown, and thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And you can also join the conversation on Twitter. We are at AJ Inside Story. From me, Imran Khan, and the entire team here in Doha, bye for now.
Welcome to the stream. I am Josh Rushing, sitting in for Femi OK from the comfort of my own home today because of COVID-19. Today we're talking about, can Trump get reelected? We're going to look at the poll numbers. We're joined by an excited panel of guests. And what I'm really hoping you're going to do if you're watching this on YouTube Live is you're going to join us in that chat box over there. And hopefully I'm going to get some of your comments in during the show in real time. One of the first things I want to do is go to a poll here. This is from 538. Which does a lot of polling and combining of polling. So it's called How Popular is Donald Trump? And if you can see on the screen, okay, you're looking. So this has his disapproval ratings at this moment, which is something like his 1,245th day in office. 55.3% disapprove, 40.6% approve. So about a 15-point difference between disapproval and approval. And if you're curious how that compares to other presidents after 1,245 days, we scroll down and it shows us. And so Obama on this day, he was up about 15 points higher than that in net difference. Bush had a little higher than Obama. In about a 15-point net difference over where Trump is now. And if you actually go through all these presidents, there are only two presidents in modern history that compare to Trump's numbers at this moment. One is, I'm showing you right now, George H.W. Bush had a disapproval rating of a net difference of minus 20 points. The other, so we go through Reagan had a positive, and then Jimmy Carter had a net difference of minus 22 points. Everyone else is well above Trump in modern history. Trump's net difference right now is about 15 points. So he is in a tier with Jimmy Carter and George H.W. Bush. Of course, the two things that those presidents share in common when it comes to modern history are they're the only two incumbents to not get reelected. So he does have an uphill climb according to the polls, but the polls didn't give him a whole lot of a chance last time either, and he still won. So we're going to talk about that today. I'd like to bring in this exciting panel of guests. I'm going to have them introduce themselves. We're going to begin with Leah. Leah, can you tell us a bit about yourself while you're here today?
Sure. Good morning, and thank you for having me. My name is Leah Daughtry, and I am a ordained elder in the Pentecostal tradition. I am an author, and I am former Chief of Staff of the Democratic Party and former two-time CEO of the Democratic National Conventions.
Excellent. Thank you, Leah. Hey, Jack, thanks for joining us. Jack joined us at the last minute, so I'm going to give a shout out there. Jack, can you tell us why you're part of the panel today?
Well, Josh, I certainly appreciate it. I am a surrogate for Trump 2020. I was also in 2016, and before that, I was a member of the United States Congress from Georgia for 22 years, and actually had the honor of also serving in our state legislature. So at one time, I had an honest job. I was an insurer. Even that job, people would probably question. But I am very happy to be on the panel today.
Yeah, thanks for joining us, Jack. I appreciate it. And then last up is a familiar face for fans of Al Jazeera. It's Alan Fisher joining us from the White House today. Alan, how you doing?
I'm doing very well. I, of course, covered the Trump campaign 4 years ago, and although Kimberly Halkett is our White House correspondent, I often fill in for her, which is exactly what I'm doing just now. And I've got to point out that we're doing this on my laptop because of the various restrictions that we have, not our usual camera setup at the White House. The cameraman is insistent that I point out that this is all me and nothing to do with him.
Disclaimers accepted. Well, look, since you covered Trump 4 years ago, how's it feel now, looking at his campaign, to where he was this time 4 years ago?
There's a couple of things to point out. One, you were absolutely right about the polls. I remember being at his second last event, which is in New Hampshire, the night before the election, and the polls came out, and every single poll, even Breitbart, which had always given him a lead, said that Donald Trump was going to lose the election. They had him down by 1 point. And the campaign thought he wasn't going to win. They thought that even to the middle of election day itself. And he won. So I'm not entirely sure that we should always believe the polls. But the second thing is that I went to a number of Trump events, obviously 4 years ago. I've been to several in the intervening period. But I was at one at Iowa, which is one of his most recent events, just before the Iowa caucuses. Back in, when was that, January, I think. And the difference is that 4 years ago, people were coming along to see the show. They wanted to see Donald Trump. They wanted to be there when he said something outrageous. So if it was on the news, they would go, oh, we were there. We heard them say that. Now the people that are going to Donald Trump events are Donald Trump fans. They are committed. They believe that he is one of the greatest presidents, if not the greatest president America has ever seen. So they are very much in the Donald Trump camp. That's the difference between this time round and 4 years ago.
So, Leah, from a Democratic perspective, Alan's saying that it seems is energized and even kind of solidified from the last time. How are the Democrats going to approach that?
Well, polls are a snapshot in time, I think, and they either make you feel really good or they motivate you to work harder. From our perspective, this is really not that new. Each side, each nominee on either side of the party has their base of diehards, can do no wrong, true believers, as I call them. And then it's the folks in the middle that you've got to try to persuade to your side. So, what Joe Biden has to do is continue to make the case for why he would be a better president and the kind of leadership that he proposes to offer to the country, and draw the contrast between himself and Trump. But his campaign has got to be more than about Donald Trump is bad, but it's got to demonstrate why Joe Biden is good, and to do the convincing work that needs to happen in the middle, besides the people who are equally diehard for Joe Biden. And that's a tough road to hoe in this environment with the pandemic happening, with the Black Lives Matter uprisings happening, that people are, choosing their sides and figuring out where they are in the middle of all this. So both candidates have quite a bit of work to do to convince people that they are able to lead America forward in this moment.
And Josh, I agree.
Go ahead.
I certainly agree with Leah. I think it's very, very dicey. You can't trust the polls, but I will say this. You know the story about the army that was surrounded by the enemy on all sides, and the general called the soldiers in, and he said, hey, listen, we're in a great position for the first time in the history of this war. No matter what direction we go. We are going to encounter the enemy. And so I think a poll like that shows we on the Republican side absolutely have our work cut out for us. But at the same time, it's going to boil down to Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, the proverbial swing states. And even in those states, it's going to depend on particular swing counties. And I know in 2016, Alan probably remembers, there was the Dornsight poll. I think it's Dornsight LA Times, and Leah's probably familiar with the Remington poll, which only polls swing states. And they actually don't just do the swing state, they do the county and the precinct in that county. And those polls tend to be the more accurate ones because, no surprise, people in Texas like Donald Trump. No surprise, people in New York and California don't like him. And so a lot of times they are heavily weighted in national polls, and it almost doesn't matter. So, but at the same time, we do need to get out there, and we need to be talking about things. I agree with Leah. Donald Trump can't be only against Joe Biden. Both candidates will try to paint the other one and define the other one. But the truth of the matter is, I think particularly right now, Americans are looking for solutions.
So the general you mentioned was General Chesty Puller. He was in the Chosin Reservoir at that time, and the outcome of it was a full-on retreat, which he successfully led. But he did not end up winning that battle.
It was still a great Marine.
That campaign. And you mentioned Michigan as a swing state, and that it's going to matter. We have a video comment from someone in our community who's actually working on the campaign in Michigan there. I'd like to go to that now if we can.
Violence against black people continues to happen even after more than 2 weeks of protests in response to the death of George Floyd. It's clear. Young people are angry, and they're unsure of how to direct that anger or funnel their frustrations in an impactful way. Next year, Michigan plans to drop almost 10,000 voter registration forms in Michigan on June 22nd. Then we'll spend the next 6 weeks following up with those people to make sure the forms are returned so that people can vote for the first time or update their voter registration address. We'll also talk about staying safe by voting early and voting from home. We're doing this in part because voting is one of the most powerful tools of protest that young people have available to them right now. And this is a way that we can win back our power.
Leah Letitia mentions there about the violence against black people and they're out protesting in the streets. Can we talk about the way the Black Lives Matters movement is going to play into this election?
Yeah, sure. Actually, the first protest rally I ever attended was when I was 10 years old, and it was to protest the police killing of 10-year-old Clifford Glover in Brooklyn, New York, where I'm from. So these are not new issues. I think what is different now is that we have social media, which makes the world much smaller and allows us to see these things in real time. And the overlay, of course, is the pandemic where everyone is at home and has, or at least most people are sheltering in place. And you have the time and the energy and the bandwidth to keep up with everything that's happening on the news. And so this George Floyd has just ricocheted around the world, really, as people are coalescing around trying to fix these endemic problems that we have in America. I think it's a factor for us in the election as folks are attuned to the ways in which they can affect change in their communities, whatever city they live in, and figuring out the ways that they can have something to say. Whether you are with the Black Lives Matter movement or not, you want to have your opinion heard and you want to participate in what's happening right now. So I think what we've already seen in these last few primaries is record turnout, record numbers of people filling out absentee ballots and wanting to participate in the process. And I think that bodes well for November, and it gives both candidates, obviously, a real chance to make their case to a new set of voters, of people who don't normally vote, who aren't the usual every 4-year voters. So they've got an audience of folks they've got to focus on, but how to do that in an absentee ballot environment is going to be the challenge for both sides.
Alan, we're talking about record turnouts, but I wonder if that's going to be affected by two things. I'm showing on my computer here, if we can put it up, New York Times story, I think today, that says both candidates are widely disliked again this time Biden could benefit. So will the turnout be affected by the disapproval rating of both candidates? And let's layer on top of that the quarantine, what's happening with COVID-19, and where that will be in November.
Well, if you just want to talk about black voters, and I appreciate looking like me, that always becomes very difficult, but let me tell you that the day after the election, I went to a protest in New York, and I spoke to 2 black voters, and both of them were protesting against the election of Donald Trump, but neither of them had voted. Now, Donald Trump thinks that he did very well with the black community. He won 8% of the black vote. The biggest success he achieved with black voters 4 years ago was that they didn't turn out. They just didn't come out in the numbers that we'd seen for Barack Obama. And that's why Hillary Clinton lost. Now, I'm meeting more and more people, and you're hearing examples of that, where people are registering in record numbers, and black people are going to vote this time. And overwhelmingly, from what I can gather from anecdotal evidence from all the polls, they are going to vote for the Democrats. So whereas 8% may seem like a lot for a Republican, and it's certainly more than Mitt Romney got, it's not going to be enough if you want to carry the swing states, the swing districts that we've been talking about, particularly in places like Michigan, in North Carolina, in Virginia. And so it becomes much harder for Donald Trump to win the election.
And I just want to interject, if I can, that Hillary Clinton, she did not achieve the level of the black vote that Barack Obama did, but nobody was going to get the level of vote that Barack Obama did. She did have the level of black vote that John Kerry and Al Gore achieved. So she returned to previous pre-Obama levels. Now, what Joe Biden has to do is achieve Barack Obama level black turnout plus in order to make this, in order to account for voter suppression and the variations in absentee ballots. But I think it's important for people to recognize that, she returned to pre-Obama levels, and what Biden has to do is maintain Obama level turnout.
And let me just quickly add that a lot of people didn't vote because they looked at the polls, to go back to the polls, and thought, well, Hillary's going to win this. All the polls say she's going to win it, so we don't need to vote. She doesn't need my vote, and they stayed away from the polls.
But the other thing, remember, Hillary did not get out. Donald Trump did go into the inner city Democrat areas, and he did go often, obviously, to the swing states. Joe Biden is doing the exact same thing Hillary does. I mean, we call him Basement Biden because he is not getting out, and it appears that his handlers don't want him to get out. It doesn't have anything to do with coronavirus as much as his continual gaffes, and he is very capable of shooting himself in the foot every time he makes a public appearance, but he's going to have to get out and engage, particularly as we build the case that in these cities that have had some of the most egregious problems, such as Minneapolis, they're run by Democrats. And the police officer who killed George Floyd had 18 violations against him. Where was the Democrat mayor? Where was the Democrat governor? Why did they not do anything earlier? And we are seeing, I think it's something like 10 cities right now, major cities, they want to defund the police. They're not talking about reforming the police. They're talking about defunding the police. 64% of the American people do not support that position. 57% of Hispanic voters do not support that position. So Joe Biden's going to have to own that position, and it's not a winning issue for the Democrats.
Well, I recognize
the messaging becomes very hard. Sorry, messaging becomes really hard for the Trump campaign, because 4 years ago you could say, I'm going in, I'm going to break everything up, I'm going to change things, I'm going to do things differently. And if the economy hadn't been so badly hit by COVID, he could have run on the economy. He could have said, look, are you better off than you were 4 years ago? It's the old Reagan line, and many people would have said yes. Now if you stand up and say, are you better off, do things feel better than they did 4 years ago? Most people would say no and probably add an expletive and then say no again. So that's a big problem that the Trump campaign has.
But one thing, Al and Lee, I know you want to say something, but let me just respond real quickly. Who do you think is going to rebuild the economy better, Joe Biden or Donald Trump? And when people are asked that in the poll, they always say Donald Trump.
Well, I think that depends on who you're asking. But two things I want to say. One, what I want to say, one thing is I think Joe Biden being out, I think that's a really false and unfair narrative. We're coming just now, states are beginning to reopen. And we have been saying from the White House on down that you need to stay in your home, you need to hunker in, buy your groceries, your toilet paper, whatever else, and so we can flatten the curve. And so to think that Joe Biden should be out when the president is saying hunker down is really an unfair thing. He has been out recently. He obviously for Memorial Day and other things, he's been making use of digital spaces. He appeared at the George Floyd funerals, and I think he's in the places where he needs to be, and that's all we can expect. And the last thing I want to say just quickly is that I really dislike that we have tagged onto this defund the police as sort of this blanket notion and pushing people to think that that means zeroing out police budgets, and that is not what it means. It means reallocating funds so that the police can do the job that they are hired to do, but not also have to serve as social workers and mental health workers and truant officers, which is what many cities are requiring police officers to do. They're not trained for it, they're not equipped for it, and we shouldn't be forcing them to fill roles that are not theirs. By reallocating the funding for these large, when 1/3 of many large cities' budgets go to pay the police and fund police departments, and shifting that money so that mental health people can respond to mental health calls, social workers can respond to social work calls, truant officers can respond to truant, and not just make the police do things that they shouldn't have to be focused on. That's what defund the police movement means. It means reallocating funds to make the police more effective.
You know what? I agree with you. Many Democrats do have that position, but that is not the position of at least 10 major blue cities in America. And Joe Biden is going to have to answer to it. That is his constituency. But what I don't understand is why those blue cities run by Democrats, why haven't they done this already? They have the power to do it right now. They don't need the White House. They don't need a new president. Police matters largely are local control, and they haven't taken those steps. Yesterday, through an executive order, the president said we're going to withhold federal grants to any police department that doesn't have best practice training. And so the training on a federal level is going to be there, even more than ever. He also set up a data system so that police officers would know. Okay, sorry.
We did a whole show on this on Monday on defund the police, and you got tuned in. It's actually an excellent show. I wanted to ask you, because you brought up the economy, that if you look at Obama and Biden, when they came into office, it was at the height of the Great Recession. They were given a shattered economy and actually turned it into a real winner after 8 years and turned it over to Trump. Now we're looking at unemployment, the highest levels in my lifetime. The economy seems like it's in tatters. How is it that you can make an argument that Trump will be better for the economy than Biden?
Well, when you do not have, and I don't want to be totally partisan here, but I would say overly cautious mayors and overly cautious governors in states that have not been allowed to reopen. For example, the state of Virginia. I walk by dangerous playgrounds every day that are roped off so that 5 and 10-year-olds can't get to them, but those same mayors had no problem at all with the protesters. And you can't have it both ways. You have to reopen. And as we reopen, we'll see more jobs reports as we did in May when 2.5 million new jobs came back strong, and they're going to come back now. I talked to somebody this morning who had just gotten back from New Orleans, and he said not all the restaurants were open, and the reason was it's because they could not get employees. When the CARES package runs out, and as you know, 50% of the workers in America are getting paid now more for staying at home than they are for working. When that changes, people will go back to work, and that's all going to be happening this summer. So I agree with you. We have a challenge. We've got to get the economy back, and the party in the White House has always owned the economy. But I think that it is going to come back, and I think it's going to be one of Joe Biden's biggest nightmares.
Hey, Leah, our audience couldn't hear that eye roll. Can you expand on that? And I'll come to you, Alan.
We're talking about getting the
$2.5
economy
million
back
jobs.
in the middle of a pandemic, and we are seeing now what has happened in these states that chose to reopen because they want to put people back to work, and now their numbers are skyrocketing as the
They're
incidence
not,
of
Leah.
but they are. It's on every news
Texas had a
outlet.
record day yesterday of new cases.
Texas had a record day yesterday. Every state that reopened early, I let you finish. Every state that reopened reopened early is now experiencing rocketing numbers. So you can't have it both ways. So who's going to work at these jobs if everyone is dead or sick? It's a matter of our morals. It's a matter of what we place as values. We can place the economy at a higher value than people's lives, but it seems to me that we've got to make sure that our citizens are healthy and have the resources they need to stay healthy. That doesn't happen if we are reopening too early before we can even provide citizenry with testing, with masks, and with healthcare solutions that will help them be and stay healthy. It doesn't make any sense. I just don't understand this argument of let's all go back to work, but then we don't have
Okay, guys, listen up. I have 60 seconds. They're going to cut us off. We're going to lose the show, and I'm going to give Alan home court advantage and let him jump in at the last one.
Let me make a prediction about the economy. That for the last 4 years, you've heard very, very few Republicans talking about the deficit, when that's all they talked about for the 8 years of the Obama administration. If the Democrats win in November, all we will hear again from the Republicans is about the size of the deficit. They won't talk about the tax cut that Donald Trump gave, which profited a large number of very rich corporations and people. They won't talk about the money that had to be poured into the economy because of the COVID crisis, which was necessary and was absolutely the right thing for the Republicans and for Donald Trump to do. But they will talk a lot more about the deficit if the Democrats win come November.
All right, thanks, Alan. We're down to our last 30 seconds. I'll tell you what, I just want to thank all you guys for joining us at home. I want to thank you, our panel guests, for joining us here in my home. And, who gets the final say on this is the American voters in November. So we will see then what happens. In the meantime, be well, stay safe.
Thanks a lot.
A global reckoning on racism. Police killings in the United States trigger protests and debates on racial legacies in Britain and elsewhere. So can Europe and the US learn from each other? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Imran Khan. The killing of George Floyd in American police custody has triggered protests around the world, some in solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States. Other demonstrations are calls to confront the legacy of racism in their own countries. Rallies in Britain have highlighted discrimination against minorities as well as Britain's colonial past. A statue of 17th century slave trader Edward Colston was dumped in Bristol Harbour last week. In London, city leaders removed a statue of another slave trader, Robert Milligan, and fearing more vandalism, boarded up Winston Churchill's statue before protests on Saturday. Far-right activists have held a counter-rally, saying they wanted to protect the statues from what they call British heritage. More than 100 arrests were made. Britain's Prime Minister has condemned the protests as racist thuggery, but Boris Johnson is accused of stoking division and saying anti-racism demonstrations have been hijacked by extremists intent on violence. French people also rallied against racism and police violence, highlighting the death of a black man in custody 4 years ago. And in Belgium, last week, protesters set fire to a statue of King Leopold II, tens of millions of Africans were enslaved and died when he ruled Congo in the 19th century. Let's bring in our guests. In Providence, Rhode Island, in the United States, Tricia Rose, Director of the Center of Study of Race and Ethnicity in America at Brown University. In London, Patrick Vernon, cultural historian and campaigner for the Windrush generation in the UK. And in Brussels, Ojiaku Wapzu, Senior Research Officer at the European Network Against Racism. Welcome to you all. I want to begin with you, Tricia, in the US. It's been 400 years. We've had slavery, we've had segregation, apartheid in effect, we've had extrajudicial killings, we've had black and ethnic minorities in the US traditionally do worse than their white counterparts. These have been problems that we've known about for a very long time, but right now there does seem to be a moment where these things are being discussed in a much bigger way than perhaps ever before. Is that an accurate description?
I'm not sure I'd say ever before. I think the pinnacles of the civil rights movement and the Black Power protests were very significant and stretched out over a much longer period of time than we're as yet reached in the present sense. But it's a very important moment, and it is a high point of lots of activism that brought us here. And so there's a chance that it could be a big tipping point.
But let me just get into the structural nature of the racism within the US. It seems to me that it's slightly different from, say, Europe and particularly the UK, where many people say it's immigration that is the root causes of the cause of racism. Here it seems to be that you have a section of Americans who have been deliberately targeted and discriminated against by successive governments. They've been ghettoized. Their neighborhoods haven't been given enough money. Why has that happened in the US? Why haven't they simply been integrated once segregation was over?
Well, the main reason for the maintenance of the logic of that drove segregation is that racism is not just a matter of personal belief. It's systemically applied so that hierarchies of value among groups of people can be maintained. And so while the civil rights movement and all of the other movements that led up to it were working very hard to create an even playing field, there's been tremendous resistance all along. The efforts to integrate public schools have legally succeeded, but in reality have failed. And that distinction applies everywhere in terms of job rates of discrimination in housing, rates of discrimination in terms of criminal justice and the ways in which it's applied. What's very unique about what's happening in the last couple of decades is that we're confronting the fact that we have a mainstream American society that has said that they themselves believe in racial equality. But whenever they're confronted with significant proof to the contrary, they develop an alternative narrative that usually relies on the behavior of African Americans in particular to explain these vast disparities. They don't like school, they drop out, that's why they don't have the same education. They don't save their money, that's why there's this extraordinary wealth gap. So there's a kind of narrative about the so-called failures of Black people that drive the resistance to really confronting systemic racism. So that's mainly why we're in this situation. And of course, there is a significant segment, although not a majority, of Americans who are old-fashioned, old-school racists, something that we don't talk clearly and explicitly enough about.
Patrick Vernon in London, let me bring you in. Traditionally in the UK, when it came to race relations organisations would look to the US for, if not guidance, at least inspiration. Look at Martin Luther King, look at movements like that. But there are now in the UK leaders emerging, people emerging, who are talking about what it was like to be in those first generation coming over to Britain in the 50s. The Windrush generation particularly is the one that I'm going to ask you about. It's a different type of racism from the one in the US, but it's had the same effect, hasn't it?
Absolutely, but just to let you know that we've
had a long history in Britain of fighting for racism and discrimination. You're going to go back to the times of enslavement. You had in Britain a Lord Equiano, a black abolitionist, fighting for abolition of freedom of black people that were enslaved in the colonies in Africa, in the Caribbean, and the British colonies. And so we've had a long history. Going back 200 to 300 years. And then the very first Pan-African Congress took place in London in 1900, organised by activists and academics. And in the interwar years, the 1920s and 30s, there was Charles Moody, who formed the League of Coloured People. So we've had a long history of fighting race relations and discrimination in Britain. But the Windrush generation, who came post-1948, and many of the people laid the foundations of creating the Notting Hill Carnival, involved in the first ever legislation around race equality in 1965 and 1968. There was a colour bar, explicit racism, very similar to what was happening in the deep south of America. The only difference is we didn't have the blatant lynchings and the type of violence that took place in America. But we had similar type of violence. But I think the racism that we're talking about now in 2020 is structural racism. Structural racism is not just direct hate crime racism. It still exists, but it's more about systems and institutions now.
In Brussels, OG Aku Wabzu, can I just ask you, what are we talking about when we are talking about race in 2020?
That's a very short and simple question. We're talking about everything that our colleagues have mentioned before. I mean, we're talking about police brutality. Obviously, this is what a lot of protests have been about. But we're also talking about structural forms of racism and systemic forms of racism, which means that across Europe, we're seeing people of colour, black Europeans being more likely to be stopped and searched. We're also seeing people of colour finding it difficult to get employment. There's a lot of barriers there for people to get employment. But also across all types of areas, we're seeing that people of colour are either discriminated against or there are continuous kind of memorials to old colonial legacies that do not include people of colour in the national identity and national history. So there's a wide range of forms of racism that people will experience living in Europe. I'd like to say that it's a common experience no matter where you live in Europe. So whether it's in the UK or France or Belgium, you are likely to be experiencing racism along the kinds that I've mentioned just now.
But is there a difference between racism in Europe and racism in America? You mentioned structural racism, that the structures of how people are oppressed because of the colour of their skin, cities have been ghettoized, things like that. Is there a difference between Europe and the US in this case towards attitudes? Is Europe much more of a colonial attitude towards immigrants in its own country?
I mean, it's difficult to make comparisons between the US and Europe. First of all, Europe is made up of many different national countries, all with their own history and identity. But the experience of racism and discrimination is common in both Europe and the US. And I would like to say that it's not so easy to distinguish between slavery in the US and the colonial history in Europe, because it's all very much linked. So we're talking about systems of oppression, white supremacy, which is global. Racism is global, and you can see that also with the response with Black Lives Matters. So of course it's something that came up in the US, but its reach is beyond the US borders. You see Black Lives Matters protests since 2015 in the UK and other parts of Europe, and it's becoming something that people can identify with. It's not so easy to just say that the US had slavery and slavery on the US kind of grounds, and perhaps that didn't take place in Europe, but lots of European historic leaders were involved in the slave trade. They were involved when at least 19,000 Africans died in the Middle Passage, and on their way to the US. So this history is very much connected, and it's not so easy to kind of make distinctions or make comparisons. We have to look at it in a kind of global way.
Tricia, it's a very interesting point. You can't really separate the history between Europe and the US. They have been connected for a very long time. But I want to talk to you about the rise of white nationalism over the last few years. It's seemingly much more vocal than it ever has been. It would be easy to blame the White House, and is that accurate?
Yes, but it's not entirely the whole story. He has been extremely effective in galvanizing a dog whistle white supremacist ideology. And by that I mean they don't explicitly at their marches usually say things like we hate black people, we want to kill them, or we hate immigrant brown people and we want to kill them. But they ultimately are absolutely dog whistling violent forms of white supremacist speech. But it's important to remember that this is not the worst moment at all. I mean, it's a kind of strange idea that we could think that kind of extreme white supremacy wasn't operative under slavery, under Jim Crow, after Reconstruction, so on and so forth. I mean, it was the dominant culture of the United States from pretty much its beginning until 1965 or so, right? That is the reality, that it was not just a country controlled by whites, but that it was controlled by whites with the express intent of suppressing all other people of color, stealing all the land from Native people, dragging people to this continent with the purposes of controlling their labor and their social standing for the purposes of expanding capitalism. And that developed an ideology around the fact that black people are supposed to be understood in every possible way as subordinate. And whenever that subordinate status is threatened or challenged by black people or by their allies, then you see a more vivid, crushing form of the return of certain kinds of white supremacy. So a few things in the last few years that made this happen has to do partly with the tipping point around the demographics, which connect black Americans to other immigrant blacks from other countries, as well as many other brown people, especially Mexican Americans, but not only. And this wave of larger numbers of immigration connects the kinds of resurgent racism that we see in the U.S. to what you're seeing in Europe, because there's a very similar formation there. But it's also about a black president. We can't forget that, Barack Obama was a symbolic kind of reorientation, which suggested that whites were not the presumed leaders of the government and of the policies that it produces. And no matter what his success was in terms of creating racial justice, that doesn't really matter for this point. The point is that symbolically, it suggested that black people could be on top. And we have to understand that, while structural racism is institutional and meters out a tremendous amount of harm at the level of economics and other forms of value, education, and so on, there's also just a psychic dimension to white power, white supremacy, which is that they must be the most privileged, and that drives the ways in which they extract resources from people of color and from African Americans in particular. It drives the logic that you could have a vastly different quality school system for them, but not for us. And so when the kind of emotional intensity that was behind the hatred for Obama, the hatred for this man, was absolutely one of the fuels that Trump has been able to gather and capitalize on in terms of fueling the support for, really just extremist white speech, and action and policy, which we see in the government, in the Congress and the Senate, not just in Trump and not just in some fringe groups.
Patrick Vernon in London. You've been watching, like us all, the protests unfold in Parliament Square, where white supremacist groups, far-right groups, have been effectively fighting with the police. Are you worried that these groups are getting larger and they're becoming much more larger and much more vocal because of the social media, because of the internet, in recent years?
These far-right racist white supremacist groups have always been here in Britain. You only can go far back as the 1930s. You had Oswald Mosley, prominent activist on the far right, and also MP. He had the black shirt, very similar to the Mussolini black shirts. They used to march in the East End of London, terrorising the Jewish community. And then had, in the 1960s, Enoch Powell made his speech called Rivers of Blood, giving a vision of Britain where black people would kill and destroy main white people. And then you had the rise of the far right as a party, National Front, the BNP. So this is part of the trend in Britain. You always have these moments where the far right comes out and then they disappear again. And one reason why they disappear, they're not organised. And number two, vast majority of people in Britain don't subscribe and support these far right groups. And most of these far right groups are football supporters. Remember, we've had a lockdown in Britain for 3 months. Most of these fascists would be displaying their anger and frustration in the football fields and terraces and sporting events. We've been at home for 3 months, and they still have some opportunity to vent their anger and frustration. And there was some of them trying to target black campaigners. What's disappointing is Prime Minister Boris Johnson has compared this type of violence with some of the demonstrations and some of the skirmishes that took place outside the American embassy last weekend, and far from it actually. And that's what happens all the time. People will compare. He called it act of terrorism, especially when the statue was moved of a slave trader in Bristol. I saw it as a form of liberation. A lot of people recognise that statue and many statues are offensive, but the statues themselves are not the issue. But structural racism in Britain that we need to address. And part of the problem that we have in Britain is, unlike America, at least in America, you have a conversation about race. In Britain, we pretend it doesn't exist.
Ojiaki, in Brussels, do we have a conversation about race in America rather than in Britain? You've studied both countries.
Yeah, I would say that in the UK we are far more advanced in the conversation around race and racism and understanding that through figures and data that's collected very, very well, I would say, in the UK, similarly to the US. In Europe, it's a completely different story. I think that it's only in recent weeks that racism, like structural racism as an idea, has emerged on the front pages of newspapers and in the media. And it's a discussion that people are really not aware or able to understand how to have. Some of the questions that I've been asked are kind of interesting. It seems that there's a lot of explaining that needs to be done in Europe just to get us to a point where people understand what racism is. The data is not adequately available to show how pervasive racism is in Europe. And this is a really huge problem because people are not aware. And I think that this is one of the things with having, unfortunately, with George Floyd's murder, you can see on video somebody losing their life, and there's not that kind of video captured of incidents like that in Europe. Not as many. And I think that that's what's happened in the US. There's been several cases of police brutality been captured on film, and quite rightly so. I think a lot of black people in America are saying we've had enough. But similarly in Europe, there are lots of incidents of racial discrimination, police brutality, racial profiling. But because it's not systematically collected, this data that I'm talking about, we call it equality data, just to know where each ethnic group or racial group group or racial group is standing in society. How easy is it for them to get a job? How much are they earning? This kind of information we don't know. So to bring these issues onto the kind of public, square to just discuss why there are these racial inequalities, it's really lagging behind.
Bring in Tricia Rose here. Tricia, this is a very wide-ranging question. I'm hoping that you will be able to answer it. We've talked a lot about structural racism, the structures of racism in the US were there. Black people were oppressed after segregation came to an end because they weren't given the same treatment as their white counterparts in white neighborhoods. Has that structural racism now changed in the US into institutional racism? Is it embedded now?
Well, I use a slightly different formula for the hierarchy of language. So systemic racism or structural racism is the biggest order of institutional racism. Institutional racism is more specific. So, for example, if you want systemic racism at the big picture level, examines how various aspects of society that are significant work in concert with one another to create chronic adverse effects based on the past and present, both past accumulation of negative effects, present policies. They take place in cultural ways, they take place in in policy ways, and so on. So that means you'd be looking at how the police connects to questions of, say, segregation. You cannot easily police black people so differently than you police whites and others if you don't have housing segregation, right? If we had fully integrated housing, you couldn't have easy policies where you can have whole neighborhoods that are on police occupation level lockdown, because whites would be living there and they would be outraged and they would see the difference. They would understand the problem differently. Same thing's true with education. So if you look at systemically, you're saying education, housing, police, wealth, and other aspects of society work in relation to one another to reinforce each of those areas. Institutional racism is specific to a given institution. So that would be, say, policing, or perhaps criminal justice more generally, or education. So to me, those are institutions, and those institutions work in relation to one another in a way that connects them systemically, right? So that's how I connect those two levels of sort of the ways in which institutions embed themselves in structures and in systems more broadly. There's one other really important distinction, and that is that structural implies a kind of fixed process, and so I've used it, and we all use it, and it's important not to get nitpicky. But at the same time, systemic suggests that it's sort of happening the way it's supposed to happen, and therefore it's a little bit more flexible. It responds to the conditions in front of it to reproduce the outcomes it's trying to reproduce. But in both cases, structural and systemic are the biggest picture, and institutional are the various institutions that make up a systemic process.
Thank you very much. A fascinating discussion as ever to Tricia Rose, Patrick Vernon, and Ojiaku Wabzu. And thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And you can also join the conversation on Twitter. We are at AJ Inside Story. From me, Imran Khan, and the whole team here in Doha, bye for now.
Are you a Simba? Yeah.
I don't really need to get paid for my work. I'll just eat my legs for breakfast.
He speaks on the phone. The president gives him the order to take the case. So I'm the one who takes the bag to him, to his residence.
Most of the time they are with black bags. They're the sports bag. I have given money to the president. Some months, it's every day the money will be coming.
Smalls will be 100,000 US dollars. It might be 1 billion US dollars.
Al Jazeera's investigative unit has obtained secretly recorded confessions and a major data leak. Over 10 gigabytes of documents, photos, and messages. They tell the story of the president of the Maldives, Yamin Abdul Gayoom. It is a tale of corruption, thuggery, and international money laundering.
What words would he use to describe Yamin?
Reclusive, brutal, corrupt, authoritarian.
He had just a bicycle when he started politics. But now, he's a billionaire.
He is the mafia head. He presents himself as that. He behaves like that.
The data trove leads to Singapore and a plot to launder up to $1.5 billion through the Maldives Central Bank.
Hi, Mr. Pfizer. How may you recognize me? I've seen your picture.
We have tracked down the men behind the deal. Men who move billions of dollars in cash stacked on piles.
Well, then let's not take that seriously. So long as they don't sell arms, my conscience is clear.
A journalist who criticized the government disappeared. A television station torched.
Guys are so hard to fight for.
At Swanky Badger, we make it super easy to find the perfect gift every time. The most popular product that we have is our personalized wallet. It's something you can carry with you every day. And if you've got a special message from someone you love, it makes you feel a certain way every time you open it. They know how much they're loved every day. That's what's special about this gift. The world needs more love. It needs more connection. And when you create a gift through Swanky Badger, it really enables you to have that connection. Our mission here is to make your gifting moment the most special memory between you and your loved one.
Hey guys, so I gave my husband this wallet this morning, and it's a personalized wallet. It's made by Swanky Badger, but he loved it. So first of all, he opened the box, and the first thing he saw was his initials. So he obviously knew that it was like custom made, which he really liked already. But then he opened it, saw this cute picture of us, and what he loved most was this. So I was able to write this personalized message for him in the wallet, and he was just so touched, and he was like, this is way more thoughtful than just, any other typical gift. So he really loved it. And then he took the time to look at the wallet and was impressed by the size of it too. So there's tons of compartments. And also, like this pocket, it's pretty sizable, so it can hold a lot of stuff. And it came with this cool bottle opener, which obviously he liked as well. So if you guys are looking for a sentimental gift for someone you love, this is definitely a cool company to check out. It's swankybadger.com, and it was so easy for me to do. To set up the personalization, I just had to type in the message, place my order, and I literally got it in like 2 to 3 days. So yeah, again, if you're looking for a cute gift, swankybadger.com, check them out.
How you experience the island life is up to you. You can soak it in, reel them in, go off-road, or off-land completely. That's why Port A is more than a beach. It's a Texas family tradition. Come stay a week and experience the island life. Go to visitportaranzas.com to plan your vacation today.
Anyone and everyone who expresses different opinion in some way have been punished.
Everybody is afraid.
To the outside world, the Maldives is a picture of paradise. But the local people don't live on luxury resorts. For them, it's either the cramped capital or underdeveloped islands. Their paradise has not just been lost, it has been stolen.
What's happening in the Maldives is outrageous. We gave out islands. We didn't sell them.
Over $300 million have gone missing, embezzled.
I'm Will Jordan. I lived and worked in the Maldives as a journalist a decade ago. I returned to investigate the country's ruler after obtaining an extraordinary data drop. The information provides hard proof of long-held suspicions.
I didn't realize that they were using the state for all sorts of criminal activities. We'd heard rumors, but up until now we hadn't seen any proof.
The leak is the contents of 3 mobile phones. Everything from secret documents to selfies. Taken together, they tell a story of corruption. The man on the phone, Ahmed Adib, the country's youngest vice president at just 33. In his phone messages, Vice President Adib portrays himself as more than just a politician.
I am boss of all gangs in the Maldives. They all operate as a fleet. I took them over in the last election.
Ahmed Adib swapped football for politics, becoming tourism minister in 2013.
The tourism ministership is known as the ATM because that's what brings in revenue for the government. It was also quite amazing his transformation from 2012 to last year. He increased massively in size. He was just so fat. And it was also all the bling bling, like so many rings, the haircut, the glasses, the suits, the cars. It was unbelievable.
He referred to himself and his friends as bro, and the system became known as the bro economy.
He was just flaunting his wealth, and he always had a group of other bros around him, and they were also in parliament, so he made sure a lot of his former football player friends got elected to parliament, and they were all the same.
Ahmed Adib's phone messages reveal how he and his boss, President Yamin, stole paradise.
He was just a shadow, a very loyal shadow of President Yamin. He took the money, he got the money, he distributed the money.
Once in power, the 2 men offered islands at knockdown prices to international hotel chains.
He was selling out our nation from under our feet. They were 5 million, 3 million, 2 million.
This building houses the Maldives Marketing and PR Corporation. It was the cash machine, and they illegally withdrew millions. Ablo Ziad was appointed director and regularly received texts from Vice President Adib to arrange their deals.
3 checks. 1 3 million, 1 million, 1 million. Bro, gifts also in that. Bro, don't worry, man.
He gave a free rein to Abloziad, his accomplice at the MMPRC, to just hand out islands and all these deals. It was so clear that from day one they never intended for this money to actually be used for public good.
The scam begins when unwitting tourism tycoons pay a fee for an island, say $5 million. They would make out the check to the Maldives Marketing and PR Corporation. But Abloziad rewrote the rules to allow checks to be diverted. He would put his signature and stamp on the back, and it would be paid into another account, cashed out and embezzled. These two checks total over $5 million US. The checks were paid from the government corporation to companies controlled by Adib's uncle. The data show how Vice President Adib led the theft of nearly $80 million of state funds.
Better make it cash or something, because we don't want anyone to know any details of our deal.
Okay.
The government is even planning a special tax-free zone for investors. Vice President Adib joked about the opportunities it would offer.
We will make zone deals, not only islands.
The untouchables.
But being untouchable can be expensive. We've obtained secretly filmed confessions given by men who worked closely with the Vice President and his boss. They describe how stolen money was used to buy influence.
Since he came to power, he has been bribing the MPs, the judges, lawyers, and everyone else. The whole system is fucked.
The president's money men are on the run in the UK. The Maldives government has put them under international arrest warrants. The men say the government wants them back because they know too much about President Yami.
I think that's why the president is scared. He didn't know that I had all the information.
Each man describes how he rode around on a moped delivering bribes. Money stolen from the people and given to the Maldives' most influential.
I have been met some of the senior members of the government. I have just personally go and give them the money. Cash in, cash out. Always comes in, it goes out. Yeah, I just call them and they just tell where they are. And I say, just go and drop it.
The plan was not just to use the money to buy politicians, but judges as well. Like Ali Hamid at the Supreme Court. The phone messages expose him in receipt of stolen money.
Last night you gave Ali Hamid $4,000.
Yes.
Okay, good.
In 2012, there were audio clips and videos that were leaked that appeared to show a man that sounded and looked like Ali Hamid having sex with 3 different women in a Colombo hotel room. And also of a conversation he'd had with local businessmen where he said, "I'm a Yamin man."
The messages show that for a fee, Judge Hamid was a Yamin man. The tuition fees for 2 of his children abroad, and jobs for his brother and cousin bought loyalty until the next election.
We will remain soldiers till the mission is over in 2018. We will never let them destroy our president and his team's achievement.
After the sex tapes, Judge Hamid came under investigation. 6 months later, Vice President Adib managed to close the inquiry.
Read the news. I have saved our patriot Ali Hamid. 6 months' work.
My dear brother, you and His Excellency the President did more than enough for me and my family. I will always be grateful, sir.
And after that video, he was appointed as the chief of the Judicial Service Commission. That's the Maldives that we are talking about.
We're talking about a man who was caught on camera having sex with 3 different women in a country where young women get regularly flogged for having sex outside of marriage.
With the judges in their pocket, Vice President Adib and President Yamin could act with impunity. Several media organizations were attacked. Rajah TV was torched in October 2013. Shani Ziad is the head of the English department.
Everything was burned down, everything, all our equipment is in here, it was all burned down. But we started 10 hours later in the new building.
Undeterred, the channel continued to broadcast. A year later, the Vice President asked police to repeat the attack, but the Chief of Police suggested intimidating the channel's investors instead.
Blast it again. No. I guess better to control sponsors. Okay, give me the list.
Journalist Ahmed Rilwan vanished over 2 years ago. He was a reporter for Maldives Independent. Zahina Rashid is the editor.
On August 10th, when he didn't show up for work, we thought, okay, he's hibernating. Monday, he didn't turn up for work. Tuesday is when his family said, we haven't been able to reach him, and that's when we got worried.
They began retracing his final journey. They found CCTV footage of him at the ferry terminal, and they believe he was being watched.
He took the 1 o'clock ferry. When Rilwan got off the ferry, he didn't get on the bus, but he walked home. Sometimes I wonder, why did he walk home? We've all received death threats. If he'd just gone home earlier, he would be here today. He might be here today. This is the corner. It's just changed so much. So he lived on that apartment up there. On the top floor. Between 1:30 and 2 o'clock, they saw like a man being forced into a car at knife point. And the car driving off really fast. The car drove off so fast that the people in the car didn't have time to close the door.
2 weeks after Rilwan went missing, police had few leads. The case had become high profile, but the president was not concerned. He instructed the Home Affairs Minister to take it easy on the investigation.
Umar, no need to be overwhelmed by Rilwan case. Okay, noted, sir.
At the very least, it implies a massive cover-up by the government. Worst, it implies that the president and the vice president were involved and ordered his abduction. We lobbied every single government body or state body that we could think of. I mean, we knocked on every single door, and none of these places responded.
Rilwan's family suspect he was investigating corrupt island deals.
It's a corrupted place where only the people who says yes without questioning will get the benefits of everything. And since we keep on questioning, we are targeted. It wasn't just the abduction, but it was also the fact that the entire state failed. I think that was even harder, the realization that when something happens to you, the people who are entrusted with your safety don't care. I think that was even harder.
Today in the Greater Mali Atoll, there isn't a single lagoon left to develop.
Altogether, I was informed more than 60 islands were given out. It's not only islands, the shallow lagoons that scattered all over the Maldives, everything has been sold.
One of the murkiest deals was for the island of Margot.
This is the place that we gonna circle around once you go to the other floor.
Margot itself, it could easily fetch 10 million US dollars if you put into the proper tendering process. Only 2.5 million was received to the government.
The buyer was New Mood Resorts, led by Italian Gianandrea Tossi. According to a report by the Maldives Auditor General, the deal broke the law because there was no open bidding. Forged documents also emerged surrounding the deal. They involved companies linked to the Vice President's uncle. We've shown our evidence to an anti-corruption analyst.
The money ended up in an account controlled by a company that was involved with the family member of the tourism minister. Again, that's a really classic case of corruption, where you mix business, family members, politics, and money goes missing.
They basically designed these transactions to look normal, but in fact these transactions are designed to steal public funds.
Adib's phone messages show the deal involved a Maldivian gangster known as TC Dave. Weeks after the deal was done, the details came out. Adib asked TC Dave if he was behind the leak.
Bro, Tossi or your guys are giving this info?
No, don't think so. Few know we made a deal. But figures and transactions?
The Auditor General's report suspected corruption. Despite that, workers are building 99 villas. A resort is due to open in 2017 under the banner of Italian hotel chain Baglioni.
The government is selling these islands on behalf of the people of the Maldives. You need to really look at the basis of those deals and start questioning, is this a fair transaction? Have the people of the Maldives got the deal that they should have done?
All those companies who got these islands do not have the right to get these islands in the first place. So, the government of Maldives should take back these islands.
Baglioni hotels say they were not aware of any corruption in the island deal. New Mood Resorts and Gianandrea Tossi deny any involvement in the corruption and say they did not fake any documents or transactions. The Auditor General's report concluded that money was stolen from a total of at least 59 island deals.
The amount of money involved in this is huge.
Without realizing that corruption went right to the top, the Auditor General submitted his report to the President.
Even I personally informed him. He basically ignored everything. They just changed the law, and then Auditor General was removed from his office. It was me. Following publication of this report, 11 members of my family received death threats.
They weren't idle threats. Corrupt police officers informed Vice President Adib of the audit, and they conspired to silence another voice.
You guys need to focus on this Auditor General.
No worries.
Maybe we need to light up his office, as he is continuously making trouble for us.
We checked that place. Lots of cameras everywhere.
Okay, but you need to blast it at any cost.
Sure, let's do it.
But need to blast it at any cost. Oh my God. Oh my God. These guys were trying to blast the office with 200 staffs. My God. Crazy. State-sponsored terrorism against its own people and institution. How could they do this? Oh dear. Such a dirty government, I never imagined. Let's do it. This is coming from SO police. Let's do it. I think the reason why this thing was going on is I warned them I'm going to publish the report. So they were trying to stop us from publishing this report. I never knew that it was actually organized at this level. And then Maldives police service, who is supposed to be there to protect and serve us, would be behind these things. And unbelievable.
In part 2, President Yamin's impunity grows, and so do the deals. We confront men involved in using the Maldives to shift up to $1.5 billion. So do you help people launder money?
My God, how can you even say that? Say it to my face, how can you even say that?
$1.5 billion of physical cash is pallet loads of money. It's something from a James Bond film.
In part 1, we discovered how President Yamin Abdul Gayoom has turned the Maldives into a mafia state. Men biking bags of cash around the capital for the president and his cronies.
He has conquered the whole system.
Later, a plot to move up to $1.5 billion in cash. We reveal the Asian businessmen involved.
Much as they say money is dirty, I don't deal with arms and drugs.
A decade ago, the Maldives was a place of optimism and reform. 30 years of one-party rule had ended. Mohammed Nasheed became the country's first democratically elected president in 2008. With stunts like an underwater cabinet meeting, he cultivated a global profile as climate campaigner.
If Maldives cannot be saved today, we do not feel that there is much of a chance for the rest of the world.
But Nasheed's future was to be shaped by events in one of Asia's major financial centres.
Yeah, but I'll do
His officials detected a
more
massive
display.
fraud. It started in Singapore, but it would end in the Maldives.
That was a very big scandal, and the amounts involved in those transactions and that corruption is also very, very big.
It concerned the Singapore branch of the Maldives State Trading Organization. From the 90s until 2005, Yamin was in charge.
Yamin was the chairman of the STO. He formed an oil company registered in Singapore.